Some artificial flavors are not permitted. How about some artificial intelligence?
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by VantageScore, a leading credit score now mandated for use in the conventional conforming space. Loans purchased by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. VantageScore.com for more information on the change.
I'm David Brancaccio. Welcome to 2025. Legislatures in 41 states passed more than 100 laws governing artificial intelligence in the year just ended. This analysis from New York University. Some of the laws start today. Marketplace's Megan McCarty-Carino reports.
The home of Silicon Valley, California, leads the way with half a dozen new AI laws taking effect today. Several require more transparency for AI-generated content, says Marian Waldman Agarwal at law firm Morrison Forster.
You don't want any person or any company to be using artificial intelligence in a deceptive way.
The use of AI-generated or digitally altered content in political ads must now be labeled. A pair of laws seeking to limit election-related deepfakes and hold social media platforms responsible for their distribution are currently tied up in court over First Amendment concerns. But the state does now ban sexually explicit deepfakes.
We see a lot of laws also related to child pornography and child safety and making sure that AI is captured within those laws.
Attorney Arsen Karinian at Mayor Brown says the home of Hollywood also has new protections for creative performers.
Companies can't just generate AI content using somebody's image and put it on products for commercial uses.
State law now mandates more clarity in contracts around the use of digital likenesses. And it also requires that performers have professional legal representation when considering them. A second law prohibits companies from using a digital replica of a deceased celebrity without permission from their estate.
Basically what this does is it just codifies it in a separate statute specifically related to AI.
State governments are likely to play an even bigger role in AI regulation during the second Trump administration, says Scott Babwa-Brennan at NYU's Center for Technology Policy.
He seems to be suggesting that he'll take a more sort of deregulatory stance and might be much slower to enact new sort of AI regulation at the federal level.
While the pace of federal regulation may slow down, the speed of technological change that challenges our nation's laws won't. I'm Megan McCarty-Carino for Marketplace.
Financial markets are closed on this holiday Wednesday.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Total Wine and More, helping shoppers find gifts for everyone on their holiday list at TotalWine.com. Drink responsibly. Be 21.
How organizations will be supervised and regulated will be a key 2025 beat for us here. This will include the future of the international rules for banks. Federal agencies are considering new rules under the esoterically named Basel III Endgame. This would govern how banks calculate risks and how much cash they have to hold to guard against those risks. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is considering changes to the way it runs mock drills to simulate what might happen to banks in an emergency. Banks are suing, saying the process is too mysterious. My colleague Nova Safo spoke about this with Greg Baer, President and CEO of the Bank Policy Institute.
For the banking industry, which is the bigger issue? Is it the Basel III Endgame and how it might be implemented here in the U.S., or is it the Federal Reserve stress tests?
Well, that's a great question because really there is no one banking industry. You know, there are multiple different capital requirements, and depending on the size and structure of your bank and the lines of business you are in, one might be significantly more binding than the other. Obviously, for the banks that are not subject to the Fed stress test, Basel is more important. I think for some of the banks that are subject to both, Basel may be more important, particularly if you're doing mostly lending. For capital markets, maybe it's the stress test. But it's what makes this all quite interesting is that, you know, what's important to you really depends on the business that you're in.
Do you think it's fair to say that the banking industry is kind of engaged in a kind of a concerted pushback against some of these efforts to kind of tighten the vice?
Yeah, I think what the banking industry saw was, you know, coming out of the global financial crisis, I think there was a legitimate concern that the quality and quantum of capital needed to improve and increase. and it did significantly. But I think what you saw with the Basel proposal and now with the stress test, that it's sort of a case of enough is enough. And then you look at comments from folks like Secretary Yellen, Chair Powell, who continue to assure markets, we believe quite rightly, that the U.S. banking system is strong and resilient. That's a very difficult statement to marry up with the proposals we've seen on Basel and the results we see out of the Fed stress test.
What would you say have been the impacts for the consumer?
I mean, all the research shows that as you increase capital requirements for particular assets, the bank's incentive to be in that business has declined. So that's why you've seen banks largely moving out of the mortgage business, particularly subprime lending to low and moderate income people. And there's no question that the price of lending to low and moderate income people and consumers more generally has gone up considerably. And I think you've seen that, in the businesses that banks have gotten in and out of post-crisis.
And for consumers who aren't well versed in the banking world, when they see that after the stress tests, after banks pass the stress tests, the results come out, and the big banks are told, well, maybe they've been holding a little more than they've needed to, they release that capital, they don't turn around and say, oh, we're going to use that money to lend more. They put out dividends and they do stock buybacks. How does that square with the idea that people would get better access to credit if these capital requirements were loosened?
Sure. I think it's important to understand that the most profitable thing a bank can do with a deposit is to lend it out and earn a spread between the loan and the deposit. So banks want to make loans. If they're not making loans, then either one of two things has probably happened. One, the cost of that loan for regulatory reasons has gone up to the extent that they can no longer earn a decent spread on the loan. Or two, there is not a lot of loan demand. So banks want to make loans, and doing a share repurchase or paying out a dividend is sort of a confession that they can't make enough money on that next loan, and they need to do something else with the money. And also, they need to compete in markets for investors and other industries. Pay dividends, do repurchases. And, banks have to say, why should you be our stockholder as opposed to somebody else's stockholder? One way to do that is to earn high returns. Another is to periodically return capital to shareholders.
Greg Baer, head of the Bank Policy Institute, speaking to our Nova Safo. Thanks to both. I'm David Brancaccio, Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.